clock here, so I thought I would at least get started and introduce our speaker today. I My name is Chintan Amin. I'm the president of Saba North America Foundation, which is a 501c3 foundation affiliated with the South Asian Bar Association of North America. Um, I am a practicing lawyer. I work for a large life sciences company based in Germany and practice environmental law and a few other things. But I have been for the last year honored to be the president of the Saba North America Foundation, where we work to provide access to justice, legal education, research, and public interest employment in the South Asian community. One of the things we've been doing for the past several years is working on a learning lab series where we help South Asian and other nonprofits around the country learn about issues that face their clients, and in this case, that face those agencies themselves. Today, I'm really excited to have Ravi Sundara, who is a partner at the law firm Spencer Fane, with us today. He is a expert on nonprofit legal issues and advises nonprofits across the country on best governance and administration practices. We're really excited about this because, first, Spencer Fane has been a really good partner with Foundation over the last couple of years. They're a law firm that I think Ravi can provide a little bit more information, but they're a law firm that's primarily located within sort of the center of the country between the Mississippi River and the Rockies. And they've been a supporter of Foundation now for a couple of years. And they've done a great thing, which is to offer up Ravi as a resource, not only to Foundation, but really to all of us in the South Asian community, nonprofit community, helping us sort of better understand legal issues that impact nonprofits. So Ravi, as I said, Ravi is joining us, and we're really excited to have him. I'll let him do a little bit more of an introduction for himself. But we hope this will be a useful learning lab for all of you, and we would love to hear questions and additional requests. I know that we're planning additional sessions with Ravi in the future, so I think you'll have an opportunity to talk to him about things in the future as well. So without getting too far afield now, I'd like to introduce Ravi Sundara, a partner at Spencer Fane, and let him introduce himself and get started.
Thanks, Chintan, and thank you everyone for joining in here. I will give just a very, very brief little bit about my professional background. I don't like talking about myself much, so but anyway, I have been practicing. I graduated in 1995 from law school, and I would say that I have basically been almost exclusively representing nonprofit organizations, tax exempt 501c3s mainly, since coming out of law school. I would say it's been 90+% of what I do. So it's sort of, that is the thing that I do day in and day out. Intersperse it with other things for some for-profit clients here and there just to get a little other experience, but mostly it's just been in the nonprofit field. So I'm happy to actually be able to bring some of that experience to hopefully help some of y'all with learning about what we're going to talk about today, which is fundraising and solicitation regulation. But with that or any other questions that you might have. So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today. And as Chintan said, feel free to raise your hand. I guess there's a way to raise your hand on Zoom. Feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. I'm used to giving this presentation in a classroom setting, and so there's usually a lot of give and take. Hopefully, we can still get some of that even in a Zoom setting. This is actually my first Zoom presentation like this, so hopefully it won't be too awful for you all. Okay, well, um, I guess before we get into the regulation of charitable solicitation and fundraising, I do need to put this up, the disclaimer that what I've given you today is not legal advice. It's just general information. It's not tailored to any specific circumstances. So, hopefully this will all be helpful to you. But if you do have questions, you really do need to consult with your own legal counsel. Or if you do have questions, feel free to give me a buzz. I'm happy to talk with you about it afterwards. Um, anyway, so we'll just move along here. Um, so regulation of solicitation, charitable funds, and fundraising. Um, why is it important? Uh, Today's climate, um, especially with the ability of people to get information and out there on the internet, just general news media. There's a climate of accountability, organizational transparency, and self-disclosure. It's all about um, making sure that the charities are doing what they're supposed to do. So that is one of the reasons why regulation has come into play, because they're trying to make sure, well, not only that charities are doing what they're supposed to do, but it's also to help protect the charities in some fashion as well. Um, Donors are doing their own due diligence before giving. They have a lot of options in terms of they have certain amount of dollars that they want to give, and there's a lot more organizations out there that they can give to. So when faced with a choice, you know they are doing some due diligence. They're looking to see, are the charities properly qualified, following best practices? Are they registered where they're supposed to be registered? Have they been delinquent in some fashion? Have they been fined? They're looking at all of those things, and they're able to get that information more readily. So, you know, in the old days, it may be that if you fail to do something, it wouldn't garner much attention. Nowadays, it actually can, and it can be put out there, and people will find that out. And that's not something that as a charitable organization or a tax exempt organization that you want to have happen. Um, there are monetary penalties actually that can be imposed for failure to comply with the rules that you're supposed to comply with. Just there's a couple examples on the slide. A Florida charity had a $10,000 fine imposed on it for failure to register as a charitable organization to solicit in the state of Florida. New Jersey imposed a $17,000, $500, so 17.5, on an in-state entity for failure to register. So, I mean, it these can happen, and I've seen many examples of a lot lesser fines, but they do generally range in you know from a few $100s to a few $1,000s, depending on how egregious and how long it's been going on. Um, so this is one of the reasons why you want to make sure that you're properly registered. Some other actions that the states can take is that if you fail to comply with the applicable state registration laws, um, they can actually prohibit you from soliciting funds from residents of their state. So, you know, maybe if it's a state, I don't want to pick on any particular state, but say like Idaho, where maybe there's not much of a donor base, maybe it doesn't matter that much. But, if you fail to comply and it's a state like California or New York or, you know, some more populous state, then it may have, bigger implications for you. Uh, but I would say that actually that the price of non-compliance, the biggest issue that charities face is actually not the monetary penalties. Certainly, if you're prohibited from fundraising, that would be a big issue. But the biggest issue I think that you would face is the PR issue. Um, your most important thing is your donor base. and you don't want anything out there that will sort of put a taint on the organization. Um, so I think you want to make sure that you get ahead of this. If you know if you're not compliant, you know, get ahead of it now. Become compliant because, in my experience, if you get to the state and start complying before they come to you, you're going to be much better off. If they're coming to you, it's usually as a result of them finding out, and they're not usually as lenient in that situation. Um, you might so you get the adverse publicity if you don't comply. I've actually had a client where just as an anecdote, talk about a minor non-compliance. They had to file a report. They went to file it. They sent it in by FedEx, so that it would arrive on the day of the deadline. Which ideally you're well ahead of it, but they were not. FedEx was delayed in delivering it by 1 day. So the monetary penalty was a nominal slap on the wrist, $100 penalty. However, in that state, they had to post on the website an enforcement order saying that so and so failed to file on time, and was subject to an enforcement order and a penalty, and so their name is out there. And so they were none too happy about having that out there, even though it's just on that state's regulator's website. But there are a lot of people looking. Somebody could pick it up, and they now they get ahead of it. Let's put it that way. Um, so and as a result of things like that, you could have a state attorney general decide to come in and start asking other questions. Not that any of your organizations have anything to hide, but you also don't necessarily want to have to deal with inquiries from the attorney general. It's just time consuming. Many of your organizations have volunteer board members, officers, and it can take up a lot of time, and you don't want to have that. Not to mention, if it comes to light that just simply that you're under inquiry, that also could be a taint in the donor's eyes. Um, and with the result that a donor may decide, hey, I don't want to give to that organization, because of that. Um, the legislative trend, well, I would say that it's to increase the regulation of charities, but we're sort of leveled out. They've at the moment there's enough regulation out there that they're not really increasing it. But what I would say is they're increasing enforcement of it, um, because they are states are strapped for money. They're looking to clamp down on some of these sort of easier things to enforce, late filing penalties, things like that. They're it's $100 here, $100 there, but it starts to add up. But they do actually they are trying to clamp down and enforce on it on the charities. Not to mention, they're in some respects there are um, there's some federal regulation that takes some of the state aspect out of it. So there, in other areas, so the states actually have a few more resources to devote to enforcing these charitable solicitation laws. Okay. So do we have any questions just generally about that before I get into some of these specifics about um, solicitation itself? No?
Hi,
Okay.
Ravi. We did have a question come in through
Okay.
the chat um, from Preetha. Does this mean that nonprofits have to register in every state from which they may raise funds?
Okay. So Preetha, we're going to get to that. I'm going to get to we're going to get to the legal part of it and then the practical part of it at some point here. But the short answer is yes. Um, it does depend on how you are soliciting, um, and but well, let's just get into it here. Hopefully, this will start answering your question because we'll get to it in the next few slides here. Um, you know, just the basic question of what does it mean to solicit. What we're talking about is basically any request for anything, property, money, anything that is going to be devoted to a charitable purpose or for a charitable organization. That's the kind of solicitation we're discussing here. Um, and it can be oral, it can be written. It's basically any medium, that there is. Uh, it can be whether it's a direct gift, so just sort of an outright contribution of cash, by credit card, however it is, or it can also encompass deferred gifts, which are gifts through trust vehicles. I've got up on the slide split interest gifts, which are charitable remainder trusts, lead trusts, gift annuities. For example, remainder interest in your house. Those are all types of gifts that can come as a result of a solicitation. And I do want to be clear about that when we're talking about the regulation of fundraising, we are talking about the ask. If somebody just sends money into you, that's not implicated in this. It's really about the asking. So, so examples of solicitation in a state, obviously in-person solicitation, sending a letter, so basically written materials, mailing it to residents of a state, or having your volunteers call into a state, call residents in a state. That's solicitation in that state. And then this is where it's implicated for most organizations. If you have a website that contains a request for funds, that's technically a solicitation. um, uh, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But the last piece I want to mention is even grant requests. So if you're requesting a grant from an organization in a state, that's technically a solicitation for a charitable contribution, even that grant request. Now, it does vary from state to state on that definition. So there's a little bit of nuance there, but generally it encompasses all of that. So now, in terms of do we have to register in every state? So let's go back to the website. Talk about a website, and all it does is say, hey, please consider donating to our organization. Well, if that's all that it can be done, it just says that, but there's no ability for the donor to actually make the donation through the website. For example, through a donate now button or whatever, something where they can actively click on it and make the donation through that facility. If it's just simply, hey, please consider mailing us a check, most states would not consider that to be a solicitation in their state, other than obviously the state in which the organization conducts its business or is incorporated. It would likely be considered to be that. So that's the most passive type of request. And so, for example, if you're in Illinois, if the organization is Illinois and that's what they have on their website, and somebody, from say Arizona just decides to mail in a check as a result of that, Arizona would normally not consider that to be, soliciting in their state. And actually, Arizona is a bad example because most charities don't have to register there. So let's pick Colorado. That's a better one. However, if you have a donate now button, now that's an active sort of what the states would consider an active link, and so Colorado would then consider, okay, well, if our resident can click on the link and make the donation through that, you are soliciting in Colorado. And so technically, and we're going to get to some other exceptions, but just as a general proposition, that solicitation, you're supposed to be qualified to be able to request that donation before you make it. So you either have to be registered, for example, in this example, you'd have to be registered, obviously in the state of Illinois, but in the state of Colorado, unless you're exempt. And then there are exemptions, and we'll get to those in a little bit here. So as a general, like I said, as a general proposition, yes, you are supposed to be what I would say qualified to solicit in each state in which you're actively soliciting. And as I said, active would include a donate now button on your website. So most organizations, I would think, do have some, donate now facility, and so they would be facing that issue.
So,
Ravi,
so
we had
Ravi,
a question. Oh, go ahead,
Mhm.
Chintan, you
oh,
got it? Okay.
great. Yeah, there's a couple of questions in
Okay.
the chat. One from Manohar Reddy
Mhm.
asked, what happens if a non-California resident, say from Texas, sends a check to a charitable organization in California? There was
Mhm.
no active solicitation in Texas, but the donor just sent a check. Let's assume that there's no donate now button or anything like that on a website. It's simply, I heard about this wonderful
Yeah.
organization and I'm going to send a check.
Yeah.
Does this organization have to register in Texas? And then,
No. The answer to that is no.
okay,
So yeah.
okay, and then one of our foundation champions has a question. What if you're conducting an online fundraiser and folks from the states you are not soliciting register and pay the event registration fee?
Okay. So if I understand the question correctly, the registration fee is, I mean, so the online fundraiser set up is it just totally online, I assume? And then, okay. And so that would be their donation.
Hmm.
So, all right. So in that case, um, yeah, you're really supposed to be qualified, as I said. I mean, so, um, and you know what? Maybe I'll just answer this now, because this is the question, and this happens every time I do this. Everybody gets to this question of, where and when do we have to register? So, like I said, the answer is you have to be qualified to do it. You either have to be registered or exempt from registration. Some of the exemptions, I'll run through them right now. We're going to go a little bit out of order here on the slides, but that's okay. Um, most of the states do have a small organization exemption. Generally, I mean, like I said, it varies by state, but generally, it's if you don't receive more than $25,000 in gross receipts in a year on an annual basis. Um, and that applies, though, it's $25,000 in total everywhere, not just there is one state that just does it only in that state, but most of the states do it in total. So if you can qualify for that, great. You don't have to register, but you'll have to keep an eye on your gross receipts. Um, there are other exemptions that may or may not be applicable. There's some exceptions for soliciting only within your own membership. There are exceptions for educational institutions. There are exceptions for religious institutions. So what I would say is that, when you're talking about if your donor base is beyond the state where you are, you need to start looking at where's your donor base and sort of take a look at um, what those requirements are in those other states to see if you qualify for an exemption or not. Uh, and if you do, great. You may have to apply for the exemption in many states. And if you don't qualify for an exemption, you'd have to be registered. Now, that brings us to the actual practical aspect of it, especially for smaller organizations. Large organizations, the ones I represent, they just sort of qualify everywhere. Why? Because they can. And so the plus side of qualifying everywhere is basically, talking to your legal counsel and going ahead and either registering or applying for exemptions where it's available. The beauty of that is you don't have to worry about, am I qualified or not? Am I able to, am I properly able to solicit or not? You already have that covered. The downside is you will have spent a fair sum of money in doing that. And then there's the ongoing annual compliance. There's ongoing annual reporting in each of these states where you register. And even in some states where you have an exemption, you might have to apply, keep up, keep that up annually. And so that's the downside of it. So the plus side is you're covered. The downside is there's some cost to it, both in terms of money and time, for compliance. For the smaller organizations, they always, the dilemma they face is, well, it's a lot of money, and we don't know if we can spend that money to just get qualified everywhere. Well, most of those organizations, just sort of as a matter of business judgment, which and I don't think it's unreasonable, and I won't fault them for it. The way they um, approach it, and the way I would sort of suggest to approach it is take a sort of look at where your donor base is. Find out where those states are where you have a significant number of people. Some states actually have a test where, um, you know, if all you're doing, especially if you're not sending anybody in the state, and you're not mailing into the state, and even if you are, um, to have a substantial and ongoing repeated basis kind of test, or a substantial basis test. So a few of the states, just one example, Colorado, they'll treat you as soliciting in their state if you're found to be engaging in solicitations on a repeated and ongoing basis. And for that, they've defined that to mean 50 or more online contributions in any fiscal year. So, and then they also have a separate test, which is a substantial basis test, which means you get $25,000 or 1% of your total contributions in online contributions in a fiscal year. So, and I think for that one, it actually is in the state. So, again, there's some certain thresholds that you can probably take advantage of to not have to register. But so I would say take stock of where your donor base is. Find out, focus on those states in which you have a lot of donors and expect to potentially get donations, or at least make solicitations. Register in those states, or qualify in some fashion if there's an exemption available, and then monitor the rest of where your donations are coming from. If you have one person who contributed $50 from the state of Maine, I would say probably don't worry about it. I can't say technically that you don't have to register, but what I would say is, you can probably make a business judgment as to whether it's worth spending $500 for just between professional costs and otherwise to register to get $50. So it may not be worth the cost. That doesn't mean that if there's an issue that you won't be tagged with having solicited without proper registration. But as I said, it's a business judgment that some of these smaller charities have to make. And as I said, I think there are enough exemptions out there for the smaller ones where you can do that. But the trade-off then is you have to be monitoring where you're getting your contributions from. And so, for example, that online fundraiser, if you are noticing that you're getting more than just one or two people from a particular state, I would say that you might want to start talking to somebody about whether or not you should register in that state. Are there any more questions that came in, or?
There are a couple of more questions.
Okay.
I'm just gathering them all. There's a few here, so.
Okay. Well, maybe you want me to keep moving a little bit over here before we hit some of those, or?
Well, let's talk about the size of the organization. One of the questions that came in, and there's another question that kind of relates to maybe I think what people are feeling, which is an overwhelming sense of dread that you've got so many. You put a button on your website, now you've got to do all these registrations. So the first question is, what do you consider a smaller organization? Does it apply to the annual operating budget, the total revenue through grants and funds to determine the size of the organization? And then the second question, gets to that other point that I mentioned, which is there a site that you can go to that provides information, some sort of easy place to look with this information, so that people can make their determinations based on their individual status, but have a guide, I guess, for
Right, right. Okay, okay, yeah. So first question, the size. So generally, the way these state charitable solicitation and state charitable registration statutes work is where they do have an exemption. It's based on a threshold for the size of the organization. It's based on gross receipts generally. So basically, any revenue, all your revenue from any source, that's generally what it is based on. There are there's probably a handful of states where they also take into account your total assets. Um, and some may even do on a net asset basis, but usually it's total assets or total revenue or both. Um, and usually it is also, obviously the assets are the assets and where you have them. But the revenue, they're generally testing that based on the total from wherever derived, not just from sources in that state. So hopefully that answers that. The second question, as far as resources. So um, I'll see if I can get to here quickly. There are resources out there. Um,
Ravi,
well,
somebody shared one actually also on the chat,
okay,
nasconet.org.
yes, yeah. So you know what? I'm going to go all the way, all the way here. Okay. So let me see here if I can do this. Let's see. All right. Sorry. I don't want to overshoot it here, but obviously we have a lot here. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. So actually, the stuff there. So there you go. nasconet.org, which somebody has already shared. That does provide links to state charity officials and there's other information out there. There's also the Unified Registration Statement website, which is multistatefiling.org. Um, what I will tell you about multistatefiling.org is actually it's pretty good in that what it was intended to do actually was to allow you to use a unified registration statement that you file everywhere. Problem is, a lot of states don't accept it, and even the states that do accept it, most of them want some special stuff added to it. And I've actually found that I think I've only used the unified registration statement in
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
like 3 or 4 states, because it's actually easier to file the state's own form than to file the unified registration statement. However, that appendix that if you notice that the URL that I've included is the appendix. That appendix actually has summaries of the state's laws, um, which is so I would say use that together with the nasconet.org website if you're going to start looking at it yourself, because what I found is that the appendix, the information in the Unified Registration Statement website, it's mostly okay, but in a lot of respects, it's not. In that some of the exemptions aren't stated correctly, some of the requirements aren't fully stated. So you'll want to go actually to the state's own website, which you can get to through NASCOnet. You can find the state charity official, go to their website, and get little bit more detail. So it's almost like you can, start with something more general like the Unified Registration Statement Appendix website, and then go to the state's own websites when you're done with it. And then when you get through that and you find out that, hey, you still have questions and it's confusing, again, that's when, talk to your own legal counsel to have them help you through that, because depending on the nature of your organizations, there may be nuances there that apply that, um, that aren't obvious. And so, and as well as to find out, how does the state really handle it? So if you talk to somebody who's experienced in that, um, because you know there are some things where I found where it says, well, if you read it, it says do it this way, but when you've actually dealt with the state, they'll say, well, you can do it this, you can handle it this other way, which is a lot easier. So um, that's what I would say. So as far as the resources, so hopefully that gets you at least some place to start. Okay, so now I'm going to go back up, I think, here. So, Chintan, were there other questions while I'm
There,
scrolling through?
there were a couple. You touched on one, but one of the questions was, and I think this person says that she knows that the answer is yes, or is pretty sure that the answer is yes. But in the example of a California nonprofit receiving a check from Texas unsolicited, if the California nonprofit then sends a follow-up email to all past donors, including the one in Texas, because they got on the mailing list, informing them of ongoing activities and having a donation link, they would have to register. And she thinks that's right, but can you confirm that that's true? They would have to register in Texas.
Well, the answer is if Texas required registration, they would have to register in Texas. And the reason why I say that is Texas actually is one of those states where they only require certain types of charities to register, law enforcement, charities, so basically law enforcement charities, military veterans charities. Those are the only ones. So, that's why I qualify it that way. And also, let's say we're a state that would normally require registration, such as, you know, South Carolina or something like that. Well, uh, even there, again, you'd want to, one piece of mail going in may trigger the requirement. It may not trigger the requirement. It really depends on the state and how they define it.
Right.
But if that organization were large enough, let's say the organization did get more than $25,000 in gross receipts in a year, I believe, and if this solicitation was sort of just a member of the general public who's a previous donor, or who had donated but wasn't part of membership or something like that, so that there's no other exemption, then yes, even that one mailing to that person could trigger. You may have to the organization would probably have to register before even mailing that into the state. Yes.
And then the second part of that question you touched on, there are expensive registration fees in many states and ongoing reporting requirements. Is there a way to do a 50-state registration or ongoing mass reporting? And I think you talked a little bit about the multi-state registration that isn't really particularly helpful, but yeah.
So the like I said, the unified registration statement was an attempt to streamline the state registrations. It really has not worked out well in practice. There also has been another effort, some years ago now, and I don't believe it has really gone too far. Certainly not enough that it's made my life any easier. In terms of just the annual reporting, to streamline that, to make it so that you could sort of file one common set of forms and into one portal, and it gets parceled out to the various states. There are some states that are using a similar, for example, I think New York, Michigan, Hawaii, you can file through 990.org, I believe it is. You can do your state filings through them, but there aren't too many more states than that who are in that platform, and so it really hasn't taken off yet that there's a single, streamlined way to just do the filings. Another thing that happened, that I want to just, I guess, point out with these ongoing filings is that they're not all due at the same time necessarily. I mean, most of them are due generally in line with when your 990 is due. So, if you're on a calendar year, normally these filings would be due by May 15th, but then you can request extensions. Um, and so you have to do that, and then you can file later. But some say, well, you have to do the registration part by the May 15th, but then the financial report you can get an extension for. So there's all these variations. Not only that, there are some states where the filing schedule is just completely has nothing to do with anything. It's, in Alaska, you file September 1st, between September 1st and September 30th, basically, every year. It has nothing to do with when you file your 990 or what your fiscal year is. That's just their window for filing. In other states, your file, like Nevada, when you file is based upon, either when you qualified in that state, if you're qualified to do business in Nevada, or if you're not, and you're just soliciting, for example, online, but you have to file in Nevada, then it may be based on, when you first file or when your fiscal year ends. So unfortunately, there's not a one-stop shop for that filing. And so I would like to say, I always tell, clients that it's not so much what you have to file that is a problem, because that's, the easy part. It's usually some states it's your articles, bylaws, your 990, your audited financials, if you are large enough and you're required to have them, and officer and director information, and basically, not too much more than that. The problem is it's just a matter of keeping up with them, all the filings and all the moving parts. And if you miss one, you may, and if you miss one, let's say you have an administrative, if you get suspended in one state, you may have to report that in your filings to other states, which then sort of causes a domino effect, and you want to avoid that. So it's not that it's rocket science. It's just a lot of just stuff that has to be dealt with, a lot of deadlines. And unfortunately, I wish they would get that sort of one-stop portal in place. But apparently that's a harder task than we think it is. States can't quite get on the same page. But talking about the states and getting them on the same page, I'm going to go back to the slide real quick. So why are these regulations all there? Well, it said the government, they have an interest in protecting the public against fraud, because when you think about, anytime there's a natural disaster, how many things pop up here, support this, support that, and not all of them are legitimate. So they have an interest in protecting the public against fraud. They want to make sure that the charitable contributions that their residents are making are being used efficiently. They want to prevent criminal activity, and nuisance, and just basically maintaining a charitable environment that is viewed as being sound and having integrity. That's the government's interest in it. But with all that regulation, the charities have their own interests that they're trying to deal with, which is, the free speech implications on some charities. Because, for example, if there's a cost to having to get your message out, well, then there are a lot of charities that may not be able to bear that cost, and to them, it's a question of, is it burdening their ability to get their message out, which has free speech implications, and then just simply the administrative burden, period, that's on charities. So that we have two competing interests there, between the government and the organizations. So I'm going to pause here again, Chintan, just because I have a feeling. Do you have more questions at all?
There is a hand raised. I'm trying to find it. I'm not used to using that on Zoom. Michael Weiland, you have a question.
Well, yes, and I apologize if I'm jumping ahead or bringing in something off topic, but I was going to ask specifically about charitable raffles and lotteries as part of nonprofit fundraising and solicitation. I've worked in that area a little bit.
Yeah.
have learned a couple of things about it. Among them is that regulation of those activities often goes down to the county and municipal level, not just the state level.
Yes.
But it's a trap that a lot of particularly newer and smaller nonprofits find themselves in, where they say, well, let's just raffle off an X, Y, or Z and we'll raise some money. And they
Right.
don't know what they're getting themselves into.
And
Yeah,
Michael, just to interject, I live in the state of Pennsylvania, or technically it's a Commonwealth. I live in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and that is exactly the case. We had a little raffle that we were doing for something my son was doing for school, and I went back and looked at the rules, and as it turned out, the school district was registered, but they had to register separately, and I wanted to make sure that we weren't going to get in trouble in doing it. So sorry, Ravi, go ahead.
No, Michael, that's a great question. It's not off topic. It's a little bit beyond what I'm covering here because I'm just covering the states. But yes, you have to actually be paying attention to county and local regulations as well. I mean, especially when it comes to raffles and lotteries. You've got, okay, so most states have, and this is getting a little bit too technical and a little bit off, but that's okay, because most states have laws governing sort of games of chance, right? That's why, because games of chance are considered gambling versus games of skill, which somehow fantasy football is treated as a game of skill, which I don't understand. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But games of chance are regulated generally. Now, there are oftentimes exceptions for charities that do that, but there are also some rules that go along with it. And raffles are one of those kinds of things because what is a raffle? You buy a ticket and you have a chance. It's just no skill involved. It's just you have an opportunity to win, and so it's there, but you have to register. And I know that, and I live in Illinois. In Illinois, you actually do have to register at the county level. So so it is important to be paying attention to all the various levels. So state, local, county, and local is where you'd have to look. Now, most of the time, just to solicit contributions, it's mostly just a state level, right? But when you get to these particular kinds of games of chance, it could get down to the county level. However, there are some municipalities in this country, in various states. I think there was one here in Illinois too, where the municipality actually required a license to just solicit charitable contribution, but it only applied to in-person, door-to-door solicitations. So again, it probably wouldn't apply to most organizations because they're not doing that. But depending on how your organization does, handles solicitations, it's possible. Usually, you'd think about who that's going to affect. It would affect missionary organizations, things like that, where they're or maybe some local charities that are just soliciting in their communities. They might be more apt to go door to door as well. So, but no, it's a great question because yes, we do have to pay attention to that. Raffles, bingo, anything like that. Anytime you're doing anything with a game of chance, I would say talk to your legal counsel about it, because that is a whole separate set of rules that comes into play. And as you get into these charitable registrations, you'll often find states at the state level, they'll ask specifically about bingo, raffles, other games of chance.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So I'm moving along. So the lay of land on state regulation is that there are 40 states plus DC that require some sort of charitable registration. In other words, requiring the charitable organization to register as a charitable organization for the purpose of soliciting charitable contributions. And and we've touched on this, depending on the nature of the organization and the scope of solicitation, might have an available exemption. I believe I actually mentioned most of these categories of potentially exempt organizations that would not have to register. So I'm not going to go over those again. Now, this is important. So even if there is an exemption, there are some limitations on it. It may be just limited in scope. And again, I'm not going to try and articulate what that might be. You might have to do a limited filing. But one example that I come up with, just to maybe make the point, there are some exemptions. Like, for example, I've got some clients that will qualify for an exemption in the state of Maryland. They're based in Missouri. They're soliciting in Maryland. But if they were to engage a professional fundraiser, now in Maryland, I'm talking about an actual professional solicitor, not just a fundraising consultant. Although in some other states, it actually could be that if you engage a professional fundraising consultant, it has implications as well. But basically, if they engage a professional fundraiser, they're no longer qualified for the exemption. And I've encountered the same thing, for example, in South Carolina. If there was an available exemption as long as they didn't have a fundraising consultant involved. And when we're talking about that, just because I don't think I actually have a slide for this. I want to just sort of let you know that, okay, so if you have an organization based in one state, they engage a fundraising consultant. Let's say that consultant is based in the same state, right? So they're both in the state of Missouri, but the organization has donor constituency outside of the state of Missouri, say, for example, in the state of Michigan. And so the fundraising consultant, for example, is the difference between a fundraising solicitor and consultant is a fundraising consultant consults, manages, plans campaigns for the charity, but doesn't actually make an ask. A professional fundraiser or professional solicitor actually makes an ask. So they'll be the ones making the phone call or sending the solicitation material with their name on it. Basically, they're the ones doing the ask. But in any case, this client had engaged a professional fundraising consultant, and I noted the scope of what the campaign was going to be, and it was going to be all these states. And I said, well, I took a look. I said, I searched for them on the state of Michigan to see if they were registered. And at that time, professional fundraising consultants were picked up. It's changed now in Michigan, but at that time, I had looked, and they weren't listed. And I asked the client to check with the consultant as to, were they registered? And the consultant said, well, everything we do here is in the state of Missouri. And I said, yeah, but if you look at how the state of Michigan, they define, whether you have to be registered, it actually picks up. The way it works is if they plan or help out or consult on a campaign, and as a result of that campaign, there are going to be solicitations made to the resident of the state of Michigan, then that consultant actually is, state of Michigan believes that consultant actually has to register as a fundraising consultant in the state of Michigan. The reason why that was important was because for my charitable organization client, they have to list who they use on their own reporting. So if they were to use somebody who's not registered, that could have implications for them. And so I just say that it sort of got off track here a little bit, but whether even if you have an exemption, it can be limited based on what else you're doing, whether you're using a professional or not. And then just as a general matter, if you are using professionals, you want to make sure that they're registered where they're supposed to be registered before you use them. So I jumped ahead a little bit on that because I do say that somewhere else, but you want to be you just want to be sure of that and ask them, hey, and we'll come back to that because there's something else I want to say about it, but I want to say it now. So are there any other questions on that at all?
There was a question specifically about Arizona.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the rules in Arizona?
Yeah.
And there was also more of a comment, but maybe you can speak to it a little bit about an out-of-state grant writing consultant, and whether they qualify as consultants in particular states. This particular person mentioned that in New York, if you're helping with grant writing for a charity in New York that's soliciting a grant, they are considered consultants under their law. So
Yeah. That yes, because it depends on exactly how the state defines fundraising. Professional fundraising consultant or professional fundraising counsel. It really depends on the particular state's definition, but many states do include that type of activity in the definition. And then as far as Arizona, I am familiar with the rules, but was there a question particular to it?
It's a very general question. What are the rules?
Oh, well, as I said, I don't know that I can get into all the different rules of various states, but Arizona is actually one of the easier ones. Arizona used to be a state where most charities did have to register. Now they do not. It's basically, I believe, I think it's political organizations have to register, but nobody else does anymore. Really, I mean, no charitable organizations, 501c3s would not have to register, at least at the state level. So back to Michael's comment, you might have to check locally, but honestly, if you're an out-of-state organization, you wouldn't have that issue because you probably won't have people on the ground there. So hopefully that answers that question on Arizona. But like I said, Arizona is a pretty easy state. There's a few states like Arizona, and then there's where 501c3s don't even have to register, and then there's a number of states, 10 states or so, where they just don't even have a charitable solicitation registration requirement. Okay. So, Chintan, unless there's another question before I get to this, I'll just sort of move
No,
along.
keep going. Thank you.
All right. So let's say you've done your survey of where your donors are, and you've determined that yes, you do have to register in some states. What does that entail? Well, basically, it's a form, pay a filing fee, usually file your 990 with it, audited financials if you have them, and some states do require them. And again, and on the audited financials, I want to mention that some states require them based upon your revenue. Again, so and it does vary from state to state, but usually I see that, well, if it's over $200,000, you'll have to have some sort of audit. Some states actually break it down to three things: under 200,000, no audit or review; between 200 and $500,000 of revenue, they'll want reviewed financial statements, not audited, but reviewed by a CPA; and then over 500 would require audited financial statements. Again, that varies from state to state, and most states usually probably break down at like either between 3 and 5 that you'd have to have an audit, something like that. So, and then, as I said, other just general information about the organization, officers, directors, and where you're a list of where you're registered, and they're pretty simple filings, I would say. So that's what you would have to do. And again, so actually this slide goes back to one of the very early, first questions we had, which is, when do you have to do it? Well, technically you're supposed to register or apply for exemption and get the exemption prior to any solicitation of funds in the state. And technically violation, if you violate it, you can be subject to civil and sometimes even criminal penalties. It's possible. So as I said, I think as a practical matter, in my experience, I've had many organizations that had gone years without having properly qualified. So either being registered or exempt. And what I found is that, if we go in and we go to register, most states don't ask, have you registered, have you solicited prior? Just one or two do. And, you answer the question and there may be hey, you have to pay a nominal penalty for having solicited before. But if you go to them and register, so it's not as a result of a complaint or them finding out or anything like that, usually you'll just register and go on your merry way, go forward. They're not looking backwards. So I would say, if you can, take stock of where you might need to be registered or exempt and take the proper actions before you actually undertake solicitations. We touched on, I guess I jumped ahead and mentioned this just now about, registration would also be required for professional fundraiser and fundraising counsel. So commercial co-ventures. This is something that I'll just put it on here. This is commercial co-ventures basically. So when you think about your organization, partners with a local business, right? In the a bar or some kind of business, and they say, so the business is going to be selling its product, and they say X dollars or X percent of each sale is going to be donated by that business to the charity, right? So that business is called a commercial co-venturer because they're in a business that's not, a charitable purpose. It's just they're engaged in a trade or business, and they are telling the public, hey, when you come and buy something, buy this or buy that, we're going to give this much, to the charity. Now, one thing I will say about those, and so in those situations, there are a few states that actually regulate those arrangements, and they actually require that there be a written agreement between the charity and the commercial co-venture that lays out, what's going to be paid to the charity, that there has to be some reporting from the commercial co-venture to the charity about what was received, what were the sales and how much they're going to pay over. And some states even go so far as to say, and the proceeds have to be paid over at least every 90 days. So there are some requirements there. Most of the requirements are on the commercial co-venturer, not the charity, but the charity may, like, as I mentioned before, with, fundraising professionals, the charity may have to report on its own reporting whether it has an arrangement with the commercial co-venture. So it's important to keep in mind those kinds of arrangements. One thing I want to mention about commercial co-venture, which we generally call charitable sales promotions, that's another name for it, is that you probably have heard this phrase a lot: a portion of the proceeds benefit. Okay. That, in my mind, is something you want to stay away from as much as possible. And especially the commercial co-venture wants to stay away from it. The reason why is because under it, that could not only be a violation of some states' laws, some states actually require in their regulations that the when you're going to say to the public that some portion of proceeds are going to be paid over to the charity, that you actually have to specify the dollar amount or percentage or reasonable estimate that will be paid over. So it's not enough to say a portion. You actually have to try and put a number or a percentage of each sale to that. And in other states where they don't do that, there was one, and this was a long time ago, but it did happen. They were found to be in violation of the deceptive trade practices laws of that state because they said a portion would go to charity. And it turned out the portion was really like a tiny, tiny portion. And they were found that they basically, the state found that it was misleading to say a portion. And so my advice is always, always to try and put a dollar amount or percentage to, that promotion rather than saying a portion of proceeds, because that's just opening yourself up to um, to criticism and possibly enforcement action.
Ravi, there's a question. One,
Hmm.
there's two questions relating to the commercial co-venture issue.
Hmm. Yep.
Number one is, does Hawaii require reporting for commercial co-venturers? And then number two is, if there was a commercial co-venture in only one state, but the charity, I presume it's the charity does solicitations in other states, do you have to report the commercial co-venture in those other states, or is it just limited to the one state?
Okay. Hawaii, I don't know offhand. So if you want to shoot me that question afterwards, I can get that to you. I don't recall offhand if Hawaii does a commercial co-venture thing. I thought not, but I don't want to say yes or no without actually having checked on that. Now, on the other question, um, so uh, if I understand the question correctly, the charity operates and solicits contributions in other states, but the commercial co-venturer is in wherever it is. And the question is, in the reporting by the charity, do we have to report this commercial co-venture? I would say that, so the way I've done it is, um, if the charitable sales promotion is not occurring in that other state, in a particular state, I would say that you don't have to report it. For example, in South Carolina, I've done some reporting for charitable clients, where my answer to the question is, are they using, professional fundraising counsel, or commercial co-venturer? They do, but it's in particular, 5 other states, and it's in person, so it's not online. And even when it is online, they say it's not available in South Carolina. So my answer on that form is none, none in relation to, with residents of South Carolina, something like that. So I would say to answer it that way. Because yes, they do have a commercial co-venture, but not for the purpose that the state is requesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that certainly makes sense to me.
Okay.
So, yep. So
Okay.
just a time check for everyone. It's 4:10 Eastern, 3:10 Central, where Ravi is. So I guess we probably still have a few more slides to go through. So
Yeah.
we'll try to get through the slides so we can get through the presentation. But if you have questions, pose them, and we'll try to get to them after the end of the presentation if we can.
Yeah. Yeah. And real quick, I have way more slides in here than I ever intended to even actually get to. So don't worry about it. It's
Okay.
really, I mean, so the main part that I wanted to focus on today was the solicitation aspect, and so that's what we're focusing on. And let's see here. So in your agreements with your professional fundraisers or commercial co-venturers, you'll want to have, what I suggest is you have that you want an affirmative assurance that they're going to comply with whatever requirements they're going to comply with, and also that you'd want to have an indemnity provision for any repercussions that might come back to the charity on account of the professional's failure to comply. So I think that's something important that you'll want to keep track of. And this is getting towards the end of just the sort of gift solicitation and just gift portion of the slides. And then I will briefly just mention what the other slides are, but you can read them at your leisure when you have basically nothing else to do. So the other area where you want, of regulation that comes into play with for when you're soliciting funds is when you have restricted gifts. Basically, your obligation is to honor those restrictions, especially, it can be either whether it's just simply a restricted gift by the donor, which is not in a trust, but you still are supposed to honor the donor's restrictions, or whether it's in a trust. And if you don't honor those, they're the attorney general of the state can come in and seek enforcement to enforce those restrictions. In some states, donors or beneficiaries having a special interest in connection with, especially a trust, or it can try to enforce those restrictions. So you just want to make sure, and I would say that documentation is the key. You'll want to basically make sure that the documentation on what you're supposed to abide by is very clear. That way you can be certain whether or not you violated it, because otherwise you'll get disagreements with donors. It can become public, and again, that can have negative consequences, just negative publicity that you don't want. And it often happens when the donors themselves have passed away, and it's their relative, their descendants oftentimes are the ones who come back and say, hey, you didn't honor this. And it's usually because they want it back. They want the money back, and you get into a fight with all that. But so that's why you want to document things properly. If you're not able to honor the restrictions, there are ways to deal with them, either by getting donor consent if they're still alive. You can also go to the court, and you can get, oftentimes have it be cyprade, which just means as near as possible. So you can get the court to say, okay, we find that the restrictions are impracticable, impossible, or whatever to adhere to. So we're going to vary them, or even lift them altogether. We've gotten that for clients as well, where they're either varied or lifted altogether, or simply repurposed to some other purpose that is as close as we can get, but be able to do something with it, because courts don't want to see charitable funds sitting there because they're simply unable to be used. Let's see. I mentioned the deceptive trade practice and consumer protection laws. Basically, when you make an ask for a contribution, if you say you're going to do it, you're going to use it for something, you need to use it for that. So just be very careful on what you say. A lot of times what charities will do is we'll say we're raising it for this, but then they'll have some disclaimer in there that says, but if for some reason it's not able to be used for that, we can use it for some other purpose of ours. Or they'll have an alternate purpose. But anyway, so you just want to be sure that when you say something to the donating public, that you're in fact going to do it. Okay. Yeah, we talked about documentation. There could be disagreements, so have that. The last thing is registration to do business, and not all states require this to solicit funds, but there are a handful of states out there that, as a condition of registering to solicit, they require the charity to also be qualified to do business, which is a corporate law matter as opposed to a just simple regulatory matter. But they want to qualify as a foreign corporation in that other state in order to do business in that state. So you'll want to pay attention to that as well. Okay, so that's all just the normal, regular, everything that applies to any kind of ask, basically, that you'll make in terms of soliciting funds. So just soliciting any kind of solicitation of funds, those are the general rules that apply. There are some other requirements. There's securities and insurance laws that apply to certain types of deferred and split interest gift vehicles, as I mentioned before: charitable remainder trust, charitable lead trust, pooled income funds, charitable gift annuities. Those have special rules that apply to them. Everything but the gift annuities basically has securities laws that may apply in some states to them. There's a handful of states out there that do that. There's federal laws that give some exemptions at the federal level, so you don't have to worry about federal laws, but at the state level we do. And there are insurance laws that apply to issuing charitable gift annuities. So a lot of your, depending on the size of your organizations, if you're large enough, you may actually be issuing gift annuities, which is just basically a contractual arrangement whereby the donor gives you money and they get an annuity back as a contract, right? So there's a contractual annuity, but it's worth less than what they gave to you. And that difference is what the gift is to the organization. It's a creature of the tax law. That gift annuity vehicle is a creature of the tax law, but it is regulated in some states as insurance, but not as a full-blown insurer. It is regulated as a sort of a special registration or special permit. And there are about 10 states that actually regulate it that way. California, New York, Washington are among those states. So just want to keep that in mind. And so, as I said, the rest of these slides mainly address the securities and insurance laws that apply. So I'm not going to run through those because we're limited time. Maybe maybe we'll have another learning lab if you really want to delve into those other types of deferred and split interest gifts. We can do that. But for this one, I think Chintan, if you're okay with it, if we got more questions, maybe we just leave the last 10 minutes for questions.
Sure. No, thank you very much, Ravi, for all of that great insight. There's a lot to unpack, I think, in all of what you said, and I know there's a number of people on the call. Does anyone have any questions for Ravi right now? We do have some additional time in our session today, so if you do have questions, if you want to pose anything, please go ahead and either raise your hand or go ahead and open your mic up.
And while I'm waiting, I'm just scrolling down to see if there's anything I can add on that's not. If nobody has any questions, you know what? I'm going to jump to these last slides here that deal with additional sources of regulation. So, so without getting into those, trust vehicles in particular, other than just to say, we have those securities and insurance regulations. But one thing that you want to keep in mind is if your organization, serves as trustee or wants to serve as trustee of these kind of split interest trusts, you have to be sure that you're qualified to serve as trustee. For example, in California, charities would not be able to serve as trustee of, assets that are in California. Now, as I've said, so what's happened is we often have some kind of interim trustee in between until the assets get sold, and then the assets are no longer, they're just intangible securities, and then situs of the trust is no longer in California, and the charity can then take over. But you do have to pay attention to whether or not you're qualified to actually serve. And like I said, most states you probably would be able to serve as trustee, but again, it's one of those things that you just need to have looked at and make sure you can do. If again, this is related to trusts, if you do serve as trustee of the split interest and or other charitable trusts, there may actually be, in addition to some states, actually in addition to a charitable solicitation registration, they have a charitable trust registration. For example, Oregon is one of those states where you might have to actually register under, as both, both for the charitable solicitation piece as well as the charitable trust piece. Generally, the registration reporting is the same for both, so it's not too much more, but it does have certain, nuanced implications if you had to register as a trust. And again, same thing as with the normal solicitation registration. There are exemptions that may be applicable, so have to take a look at that. We talked about attorney general enforcement powers with restricted gifts. and just corporate purposes generally. So as long as you adhere to all that, you don't have anything to worry about. If things start going awry, the attorney general can come in and try and enforce things to prevent waste of the charitable assets. I'm not going to get into Internal Revenue Service, the IRS stuff. There's intermediate sanctions, revocation of tax exemption. Those normally are just what we're talking about there is basically engaging in transactions with insiders for the most part, providing excessive compensation, things like that, self-dealing, those kinds of things get implicated at the IRS level. And I think that's it. That's all. We're here to down on the list of resources again, and so that's it. So you got everything other than securities and insurance law, which probably happy about.
Well, I'm going to send out another call for questions. Does anyone have any last questions for Ravi?
And Ravi's also been kind enough to agree to come back and maybe do 1 or 2 other sessions next year. So if folks on the call have any other pressing topics that they're interested in, feel free to reach out to me or Chintan, and we can work with Ravi to set something up.
Yeah, because I as you could probably tell, I want to talk about what you guys want to talk about. And not so much what I have on the slides, because that's only of interest to me, really. So, but hopefully today wasn't too disjointed. As I said, I'm used to doing this in a in-person setting, and it flows. But hopefully this was helpful to everybody.
I think Ravi, I think you really did a great job. Got some nice comments in the chat. We probably, as a group in Foundation, have some things that we want to discuss internally as well based on this. So that helped us selfishly as well. But before we go, I wanted to thank you, of course, and tell you that it's very much appreciated. Hopefully, we'll have additional sessions in the not too distant future. Between now and the end of the summer, SABA North America, which is our affiliate organization, Bar Association, has its annual meeting or annual conference in San Francisco, July 14th through the 17th. So hopefully we'll see some of you folks there, those of you who are attorneys or interested in the SABA conference. We are having a benefit during the SABA conference. That's on Friday, July 15th. And if you are so inclined, we also have a VIP dinner where we are having one of Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People of 2021, Manjusha Kulkarni, join us for a fairly intimate get-together. There are some tickets left, not a lot. We've actually done a great job in getting tickets sold for that. Their information there is available on our website, which is www.sabalegalfdn.org. And certainly reach out to any one of us if you do have questions about that. Really thank you for everybody for joining and staying on in this late part of the afternoon. Thanks again to Ravi for your help. Finally, this session has been recorded, so we'll have this available, and we'll let everyone know how to access that recording. And Ravi's been so kind he'll package the slides for us so that we can also put those on the website for your access as well. Give us a few days for that so that we can get everything sort of edited up and put together, but we should have that for you in the not too distant future, and look for your email for information on that. Does anyone have any last questions or thoughts? Great. Well, Ravi, thank you one last time. I'm going to stop the recording and I will end the session. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Happy to do it. Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.